I just received a book called Patience with God, which is written by Frank Schaeffer. And you may know Frank Schaeffer. When he was writing in the Christian market, he went as Frankie Schaeffer. And he is the son of Francis and Edith Schaeffer. Last year he wrote a book called Crazy for God with the subtitle, How I Grew Up as One of the Elect, Helped Found the Religious Right, and Lived to Take all or almost all of it back. And Frankie Schaeffer, I've always described him, and others have done the same, as a angry young man. Now, Frankie and I, he goes by Frank now, Frank and I are about the same age. And it is difficult living in the shadow of a famous father. Some do it well. John Quincy Adams did it well, living in the shadow of his father, John Adams. And Joe DiMaggio Jr. did not do well, being the son of the famous baseball player Joe DiMaggio. Frank Schaeffer is not doing it well, and I'll go into some specifics of this. Those of you who don't know, Francis Schaeffer was a very prominent apologist and social critic throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s. He was popular in intellectual circles for quite some time, had a ministry in L'Abri, Switzerland, and that served kind of as a crossroads of intellectuals moving in and out of Europe, trying to find themselves. And Francis Schaeffer was a water or an oasis in a desert of intellectual tepidness, especially in terms of the fundamentalist and evangelical market of the day. Francis Schaeffer was dealing with the hard questions of the day, and he was giving some very important answers, mostly in a critique of what we would describe today as postmodernism, but in Schaeffer's day it was more post-Christianity. And Christianity had been really out of the cultural impact of the faith for quite some time, since probably the Scopes trial in 1925. So Francis Schaeffer was a breath of fresh air to a lot of these young interlopers. And Frankie Schaeffer grew up in the midst of all this, and very talented writer and filmmaker when he was dealing with Christian work. Helped his father with the production of How Should We Then Live and Whatever Happened to the Human Race, and took these particular films on the road. I remember in Atlanta when Whatever Happened to the Human Race came, that it was a very powerful statement, a good depiction of what in fact had happened to the human race in terms of abortion and euthanasia. But after his father's death, Frankie Schaeffer, which took place in 1984, Frankie Schaeffer kind of went off the deep end. For a while he was involved in the pro-life movement, spoke CBN, spoke at Liberty University with Jerry Falwell. Very, very prominent. And there's a certain amount of truth to the idea that he helped found the religious right. He was really, to me, he helped promote the religious right. And if you want to really read a depressing book, and hope and pray that your children don't write a book about you after your death, you might want to take a look at Crazy for God. If you go on the American Vision site, you will find that I wrote a review about Crazy for God. But let me give you a taste of what Frankie Schaeffer has been all about. Os Guinness, who was a friend and associate of both Francis Schaeffer and Frank Schaeffer, wrote the following. This was his review of Crazy for God. The problem is not so much that Frank exposes and trumpets his parents' flaws and frailties, or that he skewers them with his characteristic mockery. It is more than that. For all his softening, the portrait he paints amounts to a death-dealing charge of hypocrisy and insincerity at the very heart of their life and work. In Frank's own words, his parents were crazy for God. Their call to the ministry actually drove them crazy, so that religion was actually the source of their tragedy. His dad was under the crushing belief that God had called him to save the world. Because of this, his parents were happiest when farthest away from their missionary work. Back to their calling, they were professional proselytizers. Their teaching was indoctrination, and it was unclear whether people came to faith or were brainwashed and under the spell of his parents. Frank's own arguments in their support, he now says, were a kind of circus trick. So this is not a very kind book. It's very depressing to read, to see that the work of Francis and Edith Schaeffer has been trampled underfoot by their own son. And again, if you want more about this, I've written an article if you go to the American Vision website at americanvision.org, you can find it there. So in reading Crazy for God, one gets the impression that it was Frank who was the hypocrite. If he saw all these things in his parents, he kept them to himself. And what's amazing about this, going through my library, Frank had written a number of books during the 1980s. One is called A Time for Anger, The Myth of Neutrality. And it's a very, very good book. In fact, a lot of the things that Frank says in this book in describing what liberals did to Christians, evangelicals, and fundamentalists back in the 70s and the 80s, Frankie has turned that around and has used that same type of rhetoric against his former fundamentalist and evangelical friends. But if you read the dedication, you find something interesting. To my father, a man of courage, conviction, and Christian principle, who had stood faithfully in a world of cowardice and compromise. To my mother, a woman of vision, depth, and love, who has courageously provided a bright spot of humanity for her family and so many others. Thank you both. Now, was Frankie lying about this when he wrote this book? Was this true then but not true now? And so what are we to believe about Frank's switch to the dark side today? Is he just messing with us? Is he just using his former life as an evangelical fundamentalist to make money? Was he doing that when he was working with his father? I mean, I don't know. So do we believe the Frankie of 1982 who wrote A Time for Anger? Or do we believe the Frankie today who's written Crazy for God and his new book, Patience with God? Is it as opportunistic as his enablement of his father's foray into the anti-abortion movement and conservative politics? Because Frankie says he was the one who really pushed his father into this. I wonder if Frank still gets royalties from the books and films he wrote with his father, or has he also disavowed the economic principles in the book he edited in 1985, Is Capitalism Christian? Toward a Christian Perspective on Economics. I mean, Frankie Schaeffer has made a complete switch in worldview, and he's giving the impression that he has taken a neutral position on all this. He hasn't adopted the worldview of the left, and he hasn't adopted the worldview of the right. And so Crazy for God and his latest book, Patience with God, are two very, very disappointing books. In fact, in Patience with God, he says a number of things that really will infuriate anybody who is familiar with these types of arguments. Let me just go through all with this. So similar to Crazy for God, Frank attacks the faith he once embraced and those who still embrace it. He writes that he is no longer proselytizing. Nonsense. As he wrote in 1982 in the subtitle to his book, A Time for Anger, neutrality is a myth. Frank Schaeffer is just proselytizing for a new faith. Frank was front and center during the Reagan Revolution of the 1980s. He embraced it with gusto. He has since given it up, but now he beats a drum for Barack Obama. There is no neutrality. Frank has not adopted the issue of neutrality. He has simply embraced a new worldview. He has embraced the worldview of liberalism with all its attendant atrocities. It's a shame that a man so gifted has gone so bad.